The Night Train Through the Appalachians is a deeply nostalgic tale that takes readers on the journey of an old train winding its way through the misty night, crossing the majestic Appalachian Mountains. On board, strangers sit side by side in dimly lit compartments, each carrying an untold story, a quiet longing waiting to be heard. The main character, a middle-aged man returning to his hometown after years of absence, seems to be traveling not only across mountainous miles but also backward through time, retracing lost memories and revisiting the winding paths of a life once left behind. As the train whistle echoes through the valleys and stars twinkle outside the window, moments of reflection, hushed conversations, and long silences deepen the emotional layers of the story. The Night Train Through the Appalachians is more than just a geographical journey. It is an inward voyage, where time slows down, where forgotten things gently awaken, haunting and tender. The story brings a warmth tinged with melancholy, much like the crisp mountain chill that settles in after dusk. A bittersweet lullaby for wandering souls, quietly seeking their way home. End of day station. Twilight had settled when train number 173 pulled into the small station on the outskirts of Lexington, Virginia. Pale yellow lights began to flicker on, casting a soft glow over the concrete platform damp with evening mist, painting the tracks with a thin, wax-like haze. The announcement crackled from an old speaker, faint and distorted, sounding more like a whisper from a half-remembered dream. John Walker stood beneath the station's eaves, a folded ticket in hand, eyes fixed on the train exhaling in the distance. The man in the gray wool overcoat was nearly 50, yet there was something in his posture that suggested a man who had walked a long way and one day turned around to look back. His worn leather suitcase rested quietly at his feet, like a loyal old dog. Atop it sat a weathered fedora, the kind that once marked him as a war correspondent, chasing stories across the American South. But now all of that seemed far behind him. He was no longer the man chasing headlines. He was someone returning for what, he wasn't entirely sure. He only knew something was calling him back to the Appalachian Mountains he had left more than 20 years ago. The train's whistle sounded, long and low, like the sigh of an old soul. The engine rolled forward, slowly approaching the station, each car sliding past like doors into another time. John stepped aboard just before the train came to a full stop. He wasn't in a hurry, but his legs seemed to remember the way. He chose a nearly empty compartment near the back, its window facing the mountains. The Appalachian ridges in the distance were already dissolving into mist, dark and hushed like unnamed memories. Inside the train, the lights glowed soft and warm. The red-cushioned seats were old but clean. The hiss of the brakes faded into silence. No one spoke. People seemed to understand the quiet of night trains, where time didn't flow forward as usual, but instead drifted, slowing, thinning, suspended between two worlds, the present and the past. A brown-skinned girl, maybe 10 years old, sat by the window across from him, her wide eyes fixed on the dark outside. Beside her, a young woman, likely her mother, dozed off, her head resting against the fogged-up glass. The girl clutched a teddy bear missing one ear. When her gaze briefly met John's, he offered a faint smile, so soft it barely existed. Outside the window, the forest appeared, tall black trees rising like ancient spirits standing guard over the mountains. Appalachian nights were different. They weren't just dark, they were deep. A kind of darkness with a soul slowly swallowing sound, image, and even the half-formed thoughts hiding in the mind. John leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The train had begun passing the small towns of his youth. Covington, Clifton Forge. Each name rang like a knock on an old door in a dream. Each name tied to a memory, a face, a piece of himself he'd dropped along the way. The train wheels scraped the tracks like the ticking of a heavy clock. John opened his eyes and looked out the window. A tiny star flickered above the mountains. Maybe it was just a light from a cabin deep in the woods. But he liked to think it was a star. Because for those who've been gone too long, sometimes a single star is enough to keep going. The train would pass many more stations through the night. But for John, the journey had truly begun the moment he stepped aboard. Not to reach a particular place, but to search for something he'd left behind. Maybe it was an unsaid word. Maybe it was someone he once promised to return to. Maybe it was himself. And the night, with its peculiar patience, continued gliding past the window, gentle as a sorrowful song not yet put into words. The man in compartment 6. The train continued to crawl through the heart of the mountains in the hush of night. The steady squeal of metal wheels on the tracks sounded like a lullaby for the weary and the wandering. Cold air slipped through tiny gaps between the cars, carrying the scent of pine and the earthy breath of the highlands. Everything seemed to slow down, as if even time, upon entering this land, had to learn the art of waiting. John opened his eyes when he sensed someone passing by the compartment. A tall, slender figure moved slowly down the corridor, holding a steaming paper cup. The smell of coffee drifted gently through the air, warm and laced with nostalgia. The man stopped at the next compartment, compartment 6, and disappeared behind the sliding door. John didn't know why he noticed him. It wasn't the face, he hadn't seen it clearly. It was the way the man walked. The slow steps, the slight hunch in his back, as if he carried something heavy on his shoulders. He sat upright and pulled a small, worn notebook from his coat pocket, its corners frayed and nearly torn. Inside were scribbled notes from his life's journey, news fragments, scattered thoughts, and questions he had never found answers to. He flipped to the middle where an old photograph was tucked. A young woman standing on the porch of a wooden house, the Appalachian mountains stretching deep behind her. Her name was Helen. John had fallen in love with Helen when he was 23. It was a brief but burning love, born in the autumn of that year, when he took a leave from work and settled in a small town in the woods. She was a literature teacher at the local middle school. He was a city boy trying to forget the world for a while. They met at the town library. She was borrowing the sound and the fury. He was searching for a Hemingway novel. Their conversations about books turned into walks by the creek and long silences listening to the rain on the porch roof. But like many young men, John eventually left, carrying with him a promise to return, a promise he never truly believed he would keep. Now, after all those years, he found himself here on this train, headed back into the old mountain country. He didn't know if Helen was still there, didn't know if the wooden house still lit up in the rainy evenings. The compartment door slid open gently, and John looked up. The man from earlier stepped out of compartment 6. His gaze swept past John, then paused. For a moment, their eyes met, deep, dark, and recognizing something long forgotten. "Excuse me, are you journalist John Walker?" the man asked, voice low and rough, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long while. John gave a small nod. "I used to be. Now I'm just an old man carrying around too many old memories." The man smiled, a soft, honest smile. "I'm Ben. We met in Pulaski back in '94. You interviewed me after the landslide." John looked at him more closely, and the memory slowly returned. A young man who had lost his home in the mudslide, standing strong in the wreckage with eyes full of fire. John had written a piece about him, one of the few articles that ever made him feel truly useful. "It's been a long time," John murmured. Ben nodded. "I'm heading back to my old village. Not sure anyone remembers me, but I heard Helen's still there." Ben's last words struck something deep inside John, sudden and unguarded. He didn't ask how Ben knew. He just felt his chest tighten with something awakening. Ben placed a hand gently on the back of John's seat. "Some trains only come by once in a lifetime, Mr. Walker. But some come back at just the right time." He turned and walked away, leaving John sitting there, in the soft amber light of the train, with an old photograph in hand and a heart beating fast like it did at 23. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Tiny white flakes drifted past the window, shimmering like memories rushing backward toward the train. The guitar in the night. The train stopped at the third small station since leaving Lexington. An old wooden depot sat quietly under a single yellow light. No one got off. Only one person boarded. A middle-aged woman with a large canvas bag in hand, her face lined with time yet still carrying the gentle softness of someone from the mountains. She chose a seat in the front car, across from a young man holding a guitar, lazily picking out a few aimless, incomplete notes. John remained in his seat, eyes half closed. But his ears stayed alert, because beneath the sound of iron wheels rolling and the soft tapping of wind against the glass, he heard something else. Music. It was unrefined, unpolished, simple. Just a few bare chords, played with bare hands, like someone was trying to retrace a melody from memory. Maybe it was an old love song, maybe some forgotten folk tune, but it was enough to still the heart. John opened his eyes. Across the aisle, the young man was bowed over his guitar, his fingers brushing the strings like he was speaking to the night itself. The woman who just boarded sat silently across from him, eyes distant, gazing out the window. John rose and slowly walked toward them. "You play well," he said, voice low and easy. "What's the tune?" The young man looked up, surprised but smiling. "I'm not sure. Just a few chords my mom used to hum. When I was little, whenever winter came to the mountains, she'd play this by the fireplace." "Where are you headed?" John asked, realizing almost with amusement that he now spoke like someone who'd grown used to listening to strangers. "Waynesboro," the young man replied. "Mom passed away last fall. Dad didn't stay around long after. I heard the old house is still there, so I figured I'd go back. Might sell it, or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll stay." The woman, who hadn't spoken since she boarded, finally broke her silence. Her voice was gravelly low. "It's not easy, letting go of a house in the mountains, especially when someone you love once lived there." They both turned to her. She had her hands clasped, not looking at either of them, eyes fixed instead on the dark sky outside. John sat down in the seat between them. He didn't know when it happened, but his heart had softened, like the young man's music had brushed the dust off something long buried inside him. "Once," the woman went on, "I rode this train, but the other direction. It was 1978. I left everything. A house, a husband, a son not yet 3 years old, because I thought I still had dreams to chase. No one interrupted. No one asked why." She spoke like someone who only needed to unburden herself, not to be judged. "But 3 years later I went back. Not by train. I took a bus, then walked the last stretch. I stood in front of that house the entire afternoon. Couldn't bring myself to knock." Her voice softened. The young man let the final notes of his song fade away. The whole car seemed to hold its breath. "He didn't open the door," she continued, exhaling slowly. "But the light was still on inside." John didn't know what to say, only that something inside him tightened, deep and aching. Outside the window, the Appalachian mountains rose faintly in the night, like a great blanket draped over the pasts of hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Beneath the thin layer of snow could be her footprints, or Helen's or John's, or even those of this young man returning to an old house. The train kept moving. The stories kept flowing, not loud, not needing an ending. Because not everyone needs an ending. Sometimes all it takes is someone to listen, and a soft tune in the night, to remind us we're not entirely lost. John returned to his compartment, feeling lighter. He opened his little notebook, and for the first time in many years began to write. "On the night train through the Appalachians, I heard an unnamed song, met a woman with no regrets, and saw a young man carrying his mother's music. None of them knew me, but each of them reminded me of who I used to be. The memory box. It was still dark, but snow had already begun to fall thick and heavy. Large flakes drifted silently down, landing on the window pane and melting slowly, like the breath of someone just waking from a dream. John awoke in the middle of the night, unsure if it was the cold or a strange feeling stirring in his chest. He put on another coat and stepped into the narrow hallway. The train had just stopped at a small station, Greystone Hollow, a place barely marked on any modern map. A passenger had just boarded, wrapped tightly in a thick overcoat. He carried an old wooden box, about half a meter long, wrapped in coarse, oatmeal-colored fabric and tied with leather straps. There was something in his demeanor that made John pause. The man wasn't young, perhaps about John's age, but his eyes were different. They held the look of someone who had lived too long with something left unsaid. The man sat in the last compartment of the car, across from John, resting the box on his lap and gently running his hand along the wooden edge, as if caressing a memory. "Excuse me," John said after a moment of silence. "I'm just curious. What's in the box?" The man looked up at him with an unreadable expression. Not guarded, not exactly friendly either, but more like someone weighing whether or not to unlock a door that had been shut for many years. Then he smiled faintly, a smile laced with regret. "It's a memory box," he said. "I made it to hold the things I couldn't put into words." John raised an eyebrow. "Memories you couldn't write down? I used to be a journalist. I thought everything could be told as a story." "Have you ever told a story?" the man asked quietly, like a breeze. "Where you were the one who was wrong?" John went still. That wasn't just a question. It was a blow aimed right at the part of him he always tried to avoid. The man opened the box. Inside were thick, yellowed papers, a few handwritten letters, a handkerchief embroidered with daisies, and most notably, a handwritten sheet of music laid gently in the center. "She was a musician," he said. "An unknown one, from a small town called Willer's Creek. Back then, I was a history teacher. I used to visit the cafe where she played every evening. I never asked her name. I just listened. But I fell in love with her through her music." John swallowed. His heart slowed. "Then one day," the man continued, "she didn't show up. The cafe closed. I searched everywhere, asked the old owner, and they just said she moved away. No one knew where. No one remembered her name. But I kept the last piece of music she left on the piano. It's right here." He took out the sheet and handed it to John. On it, in delicate handwriting, were the words, "For the one who listened in silence." Below it, the musical notes blurred in places as if by tears. John stared for a long time. His hands trembled slightly. "You kept it all these years?" he asked hoarsely. 35 years, the man replied with a sad smile. "I stopped searching, but I kept it to remind myself of one thing, that listening is also a way of loving. I just wish I had said something." They both sat in silence. The train curved along the tracks, the ceiling lights swaying gently, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. John sighed. I also have something I never said. To a woman named Helen. The man didn't ask anything else. He just nodded, as if the two of them had shaken hands in silence. My name is Elijah, he said, and I think maybe it's time I bring this box back to where it began. Maybe she's still alive. Maybe not. But at the very least, the memories still are. John clenched his hand, then slowly stood up. If you don't mind, he said, I'd like to hear that piece. I know a little piano. There's an old one in the dining car. Elijah looked at him, surprised at first, then his gaze softened. Then let's let tonight be remembered for something, no longer filled with regret. At the end of the chapter, two old men, with their shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, walked toward the quiet dining car. A snowy night. A song never played before rose softly in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, stirring things long thought forgotten. The forgotten town. Morning came slowly. The sun, still drowsy behind the mountains, cast only a thin layer of golden silk across the pine ridges. Snow clinging to the train windows now sparkled in the early light, but no one on the train seemed to notice. Everyone was still sleepy or silent, as if living in a world of their own. Except for John. He had been awake for a while. In his hands was an old letter, neatly folded and tucked into his coat pocket years ago. The paper had yellowed, and the ink at the bottom blurred, perhaps by someone's tears, or maybe by rain drifting through the cracks of some attic window. The letter was handwritten, beginning with a simple line. If one day you return to these mountains, and if you still remember who I am, go to the small church in a town called Ashwood Hollow. That name, Ashwood Hollow, was now glowing on the digital display above the train aisle. Next stop, Ashwood Hollow. Stopping time, 15 minutes. John closed his eyes and took a deep breath. That was where Helen once lived. No, more accurately, where they once loved. In the late 1970s, when John had just begun his career in journalism, he went to Ashwood Hollow to write an article about the Appalachian ecosystem. But he ended up writing nothing, except for a handful of letters that were sent and never answered. Helen was a literature teacher. She loved collecting old Southern poetry, drank ginger tea, and took morning walks to the edge of the woods to listen to the birds. They met at the town's only gas station, and during those 3 months, John thought, maybe this is where I'll stay forever. But he left, not because he stopped loving her, but because he was afraid. Afraid that the love was too real. Afraid that he could never be the man Helen deserved. And after that, John never came back. When the train stopped, the town emerged through a soft, misty light. Ashwood Hollow was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe it hadn't changed at all. Perhaps it was just him, having spent too long in the loud, restless city. Low rooftops, wooden chimneys, snow-covered hills, and a stone bridge crossing a frozen creek. Someone waved at the train, out of habit maybe, even though no one else got off. Except for John. He stepped down, his shoes crunching lightly on the snow, eyes scanning as if searching for a familiar face in the folds of memory. The train would only wait 15 minutes. Just enough time to find a shadow or lose it again. He moved quickly down the cobbled street, crossed the old intersection, then turned left, following memory alone, up a small hill where a pointed-roof white church once stood. It was still there, older, more weathered, but the bell tower still stood tall against the sky. No one guarded it. The door was left ajar, as if waiting for someone who was late. John stepped inside. Dust lingered in the air, sunlight slanting through stained glass windows, casting warm amber light onto an old wooden piano in the corner. And there, beside the altar, was a charcoal portrait of a woman, framed in carved wood, small and delicate. John walked over, his heart clenched. It was Helen. The drawing wasn't finished. The lips were only lightly sketched, but the eyes were unmistakable. Still the same eyes, gentle, sorrowful, and somehow still waiting for someone. Footsteps echoed behind him. John turned. A young woman stood there, soft brown hair, wearing a long knit coat and carrying a basket of bread. She looked at him with a gaze that was half curious, half cautious. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. John answered slowly, I'm looking for Helen. Helen Whitmore." The girl paused, then set her basket down. "She was my aunt," she said quietly. "She passed away last year." The words were like a blade, slow, dull, but deep. John didn't speak. He only lowered his head, still staring at the drawing. "But before she passed," the girl continued, "she used to come here to draw. She didn't say much, only that if a man named John ever came back, I should give him this." She reached into her basket and pulled out a pale blue envelope, tied with a red thread. John took it. His hands trembled. He untied the string. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The handwriting was rushed but familiar. "John, if you're reading this, it means the train has brought you back to the right place. I'm not angry that you left. I only hoped that, in all your long travels, there would be one journey home. And you came back. Thank you. Ash." John folded the letter, his eyes blurred with tears. In the distance, the train whistle echoed, reminding him that time never stops, and some trains don't wait. He turned to the girl and spoke softly, like a prayer. She once said, "If I ever came back, even just once, then it wouldn't be too late. Do you believe that?" The girl smiled and quietly nodded. At the end of the chapter, John stepped out of the church, snow falling gently on his shoulders. He turned once more to look at the bell tower, then returned to the train, carrying Helen's final letter, and the feeling that, this time, he hadn't come too late. The man standing on the edge of time, John returned to the train just as the snow had begun to melt on his shoulders. It felt like he had stepped out of a dream, long, aching, and strangely tender. In his hand was Helen's letter, folded carefully and placed inside the inner pocket of his wallet. It wasn't a goodbye, but rather a quiet song, closing the final chapter of a love that never chose to be complete, yet had somehow gently endured. The train began to move. John sat back in his old seat. Most of the passengers had changed, some boarding, others leaving. Only Elijah remained, still thumbing through an old newspaper, eyes distant and wandering. John thought about telling him, about Ashwood Hollow, about Helen, but before he could speak, a voice rose from the back of the car, deep, warm, and chillingly familiar. "John Whitmore? Is that really you?" John spun around. A man in his early 60s, tall and slender, wearing a wool coat and a dark fedora. His hair was silver, but his eyes, still sharp, still bright, seemed untouched by the passage of time. Thomas Avery, John's old best friend, and the last person to see Helen before she vanished from his life. They sat across from each other in the dining car, bathed in soft yellow light that glowed against the old wooden walls, while the train wheels murmured steadily like the breath of the mountains outside. "How long has it been?" Thomas asked, sipping coffee. 30 years? 40? Almost 40, John replied quietly. "You still live around here?" Thomas nodded. "Never left. Unlike you." The space between them felt thick. Not hostile exactly, but like a room long sealed off, now opened, revealing the dust and scratches time had left behind. John spoke first. "She's gone." Thomas paused, then nodded, eyes fixed on some invisible place. "I know." "How?" Thomas set down his cup, answering slowly, "Because I was the one who brought her home from the hospital. It was her heart. Caught it too late. Nothing they could do." John felt a slow, tight squeeze in his chest. "She lived alone in a little wooden cabin on the hill, above Willer's Creek. I used to visit every week, fix the roof, chop wood. But she never mentioned you." John looked him in the eye. "Because she was angry at me?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "No. Because she never stopped thinking about you." John sat in silence. Thomas went on. "She wrote to you every year, sent letters to the same old address in Nashville, the place you two shared that summer. But you never replied. Not once." John rubbed his forehead, whispering, "I moved. Never left a forwarding address." "And she didn't have a phone," Thomas said softly. "No email. No internet. She lived through the old ways. Handwritten letters and piano melodies drifting from open windows. Outside the window, the Appalachian range stretched endlessly. Mist-covered ridges, frozen creeks, forests that looked like they had no end." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled something out. An old postcard, faded with time. "She never got to send this," he said. "Wrote it a few weeks before she passed." John took it. The handwriting was soft, even. It read only one simple line. "If you ever come back, I hope you still remember the melody of that summer." John let out a silent laugh. It was the tune he had once made up for Helen, the day they sat beside a small lake. Him humming the first few notes, her smiling and whispering, "I'll keep that in my heart forever." Thomas stood. "She never forgot you, John. But she didn't wait either. She lived deeply, beautifully, and she left in peace." John watched his old friend walk away. His heart felt lighter and heavier all at once, like being forgiven, yet losing the last chance to say, "I'm sorry." Night fell. The train glided through a quiet valley. John returned to his cabin, sat by the window, and played Helen's old melody. The notes rang out wordless, but full of everything he could never say. As the train crossed a wooden bridge, John caught his reflection in the glass. And behind him, just for a moment, there seemed to be a long-haired figure smiling gently. Was it imagination or memory come alive? He didn't know, but he wasn't afraid, because now he had truly come home. Words written in the night. That night, as the train glided through hills as dark as ink, John didn't sleep. The train car was silent. Soft yellow light reflected off the small table in front of him. In the distance, the hum of the wheels rolling on the tracks felt like a lullaby, one that carried you back to old memories, or into the kind of loneliness no one ever speaks about. John pulled out an old leather notebook from his suitcase, the kind he once used as a war correspondent. The first pages were yellowed, filled with shorthand notes and fragments of unfinished interviews. But tonight he started over as if being reborn. He wrote, "I used to think love was like the news. Comes, it goes. Maybe intense, maybe lingering, but always eventually swallowed by time. I was wrong. Some things don't disappear. They just quietly become part of you. The way mountains hold the echoes of old winds, or how a lake remembers the moonlight it once wore." His pen moved slowly. Every word felt drawn from the heart. He wrote about Helen, not as a lost lover, but as a gentle wound. No embellishments, no excuses, just the truth. How they met, why they parted, and what brought him back after all these years. With each line, the blurry pieces of memory came into focus. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to anyone who had ever let go, ever turned back, ever wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but didn't get the chance. As dawn neared and he set down his pen, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. "Writing about Helen?" It was Elijah. John nodded. "I think it's finally what I'm meant to do." Elijah sat across from him, cradling a fresh cup of coffee. There was something in that old man's eyes, like someone who had seen the world fall apart and mend itself again, more than once. "You know," Elijah said, "I've ridden trains across this whole country, met all kinds, happy folks, broken ones, people chasing the past, and others running from the future. But most of them, they're carrying a story they haven't told. John stayed quiet. Elijah asked, "And you? Who are you telling this story to?" John smiled. "To anyone who's ever loved someone, but didn't know how to hold on." Elijah nodded, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out an old manila folder and slid it across the table. On the front, it read, "Appalachian Review, November Special Issue, Stories from the Night Train." "This is a journal I contribute to," Elijah said. "I don't write. I just travel and find the right people who do. You could send them your draft." John looked at him, surprised. "Why me?" Elijah shrugged. "Because I can tell you're not writing to be famous. You're writing because something inside you needs to be said. And sometimes, that's enough." When the train stopped at a small, nameless station in the woods, no signs, no one waiting, Elijah stood. "I get off here," he said. "You keep going. Your journey isn't done yet." John took his hand and held it tight. "Thank you. I don't think I could have written any of this if I hadn't met you." Elijah smiled, then stepped off the train. His figure disappeared into the morning mist and tall trees. John returned to his seat. He opened the notebook again and wrote one final line for the night. "Maybe I'm too old to start a new love, but I'm just the right age to rewrite an old one, with all the tenderness time has taught me." He looked out the window. The sun was rising. The train kept moving, carrying an old man, an untold story, and a notebook slowly filling with truth. Nashville, what remains? The train arrived in Nashville on a gray early winter afternoon. John stepped off the platform, his hand gripping the leather notebook, now nearly filled with words. The familiar sounds of the city rushed in all at once. Honking cars, guitar music from a street corner, the scent of coffee swirling with cold wind. It all felt like the faded soundtrack of an old film in which he had once been the main character. Nearly 40 years had passed since he left this place. After that final argument with Helen, the same place where, according to Thomas, she had patiently sent dozens of letters he never received. Now he had returned, not to find what was lost, but to face what had never been closed. John rented a small room on the south side of the city, near Music Row. There he spent days walking through old haunts. The park where he and Helen once sat listening to street music. The bookstore where they had shared their love of classic novels. The little cafe on the corner, where once there had been an oak table carved with H+J 1981. The table was gone. The cafe had changed hands. But the memories remained, in the sense, the light, and the way an old man could stand still on a crowded street, as if hearing distant echoes of laughter long past. A few days later, he received a handwritten letter with no return address, just a name, Martha Avery. When he opened it, he found a woman's handwriting, careful and elegant. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, I'm Helen's niece, Martha. I found you through an article you published in the Appalachian Review. Though we've never met, my aunt spoke of you often. She once told me, if you ever meet him, give him my final gift. Please come visit me at the cabin by Willer's Creek, Ashwood Hollow. I've lived there since she passed." John folded the letter, his heart pounding. He hadn't known his story had been published. Elijah must have submitted it for him. And now another door was opening. 2 days later, John returned to Ashwood Hollow, this time not to find Helen, but to speak a final word to a living piece of memory. The place where they had loved, parted, and lived two parallel lives that never touched again. The wooden cabin still stood quietly on the hillside, moss-covered and weathered, but not abandoned. Martha, a woman in her 30s with brown hair and eyes so much like Helen's, stood waiting on the porch. "I knew you'd come," she said, offering a gentle smile. Inside, everything remained just as he remembered. The wooden bookshelves, the small piano, the vase of dried flowers by the window. John's heart trembled, like the young man he once was, stepping for the first time into Helen's world. Martha handed him a small wooden box. Aunt Helen said, "If you ever came back, then you were meant to have this." John opened the box. Inside were letters never sent. More than 30 of them, one for each year, and a small notebook filled with handwritten music. His song, the summer melody, now fully completed. Helen had finished it. John broke into tears. That night, he sat by Helen's old piano and played the melody once more. His fingers trembled, but each note rang clear as it had all those years ago. Martha quietly placed a recorder on the table. "I think this should be captured. Maybe your story with her isn't quite finished." John nodded. Not an ending, but a new beginning, in the gentlest way. Before leaving Ashwood Hollow once more, John wrote in his notebook, "I didn't come back to live in the past. I came back to understand why it still lives in me. And now that the story has been told, I can move on, carrying the love without the regret." The Silent Readers. 2 months after leaving Ashwood Hollow, John returned to Nashville, this time with a different spirit. No longer a seeker, he had become a storyteller. The manuscript Night Train Through the Appalachians, a collection of memories, unsent letters, and emotional journeys, had been fully published by the Appalachian Review as a serialized novella. Then, something John hadn't expected happened. Readers found their way to him, not with a flood of noisy praise, but through handwritten letters, brief messages, quiet, heartfelt whispers from people who had once loved, once lost, once missed their chance. One spring afternoon, John sat in a quiet cafe in East Nashville. A new place, soft jazz playing, peaceful atmosphere. A woman in her 50s with graying hair approached. "Are you John Whitmore?" she asked gently. John nodded. "I take it you've read my story." She smiled and pulled out a chair. "I lost my husband 10 years ago. Since then, I haven't been able to read more than a page of anything. But your story, I don't know why, but I read it in one sitting. and then I cried. I hadn't cried like that in years. John said nothing. She didn't need more. But he offered softly, I wrote it because I was once like you. And I think, sometimes, people need someone to say what they haven't yet found the words for. In the weeks that followed, he was invited to small readings at libraries, independent bookstores, and once even at an old train station converted into a bar. He was never a grand speaker. He simply read a few passages aloud, then listened as others shared their stories. Everyone, it seemed, carried a Helen of their own, someone who had remained behind. One night, after a reading in Knoxville, while packing up his things, a young woman approached. She didn't speak, just handed him a blue envelope. Inside was a single sentence. Thank you for writing what I tried to forget. I think I'm going back to the place I once didn't have the courage to wait. John folded the letter and smiled. He didn't know who she was, didn't know how her love story began or ended, but he understood, and that was enough. One morning in mid-April, John received a call from Martha. Her voice was full of excitement. Mr. John, I have news. A publisher in New York wants to print your entire story as a book. They're calling it an Appalachian love story for the 21st century. They asked if you'd be willing to write an epilogue. John chuckled. An epilogue? After everything I've written? Yes, Martha said. They said people want to know, after the train stopped, how the storyteller lived. John looked out the window. The breeze stirred the trees, still holding morning dew. At his age, he never imagined starting anything new. But then he said, tell them, I'll try. That evening, John took out his old leather notebook. The cover was worn, the pages soft and wrinkled with time. Still, he began again on the first page, as if it were a new beginning. We often think the most beautiful things are behind us, but then we realize the true beauty lies in telling that past and having someone see themselves in it. This world may be quieter than most believe, but it's never short of silent readers waiting for a story that can heal them. John wrote, not for Helen anymore, not even for himself, but for those who never got the chance to board that train. He wrote so they would know there's always a place for memory to anchor, a word left unsaid to finally be spoken, and a final stop that isn't just an end, but perhaps the place where something truly begins. The train to the distant city. One May morning, the phone rang in John's small apartment. The voice on the other end was that of a woman in her early 40s, fast-paced, articulate, with the clarity of someone used to the rhythm of a big city. Hello, Mr. Whitmore. This is Lena Brooks, an editor from Mariner Books in New York. I just finished your manuscript, and to be honest, I cried when I reached chapter 5. John smiled gently. Then I suppose I'm not the only one. Lena continued, her voice now laced with excitement. We'd love to publish Night Train Through the Appalachians as a full-length novel. And, If you're willing, we'd like to host a book talk and signing at the New York Central Library next month. It's a rare opportunity. Readers today are craving stories with emotional depth, and yours is a quiet voice in a world that's grown far too loud. John went still. It had been many years since he'd last been to New York, a city where, once upon a time, he'd lost himself in the whirlwind of work. And now, maybe that same city would be the place to gently close the long journey, only this time in a different way. 2 weeks later, John stepped off a flight at JFK. June in New York was bright with sunlight and bustling with people. He felt small amidst the towering buildings and flowing crowds, but not out of place. In his hand was a small suitcase, and in his heart, the quiet whispers of memories already written. The book event was held in a grand old room at the Central Library. Red brick walls, vaulted ceilings, and warm yellow lights that seemed to soften the air itself. Lena greeted him with a beaming smile. "Are you ready?" John nodded. "I don't expect too many people." Lena laughed. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore, you have no idea." The room was full. Young faces, old ones. Some carried worn-out issues of the Appalachian Review. An elderly couple sat hand in hand. A young man in the front row looked both nervous and hopeful. A woman wearing a shawl placed a weathered old letter on the table before her. When John stepped up to the podium, the room fell completely silent. He began slowly. "I used to think my story wasn't anything special. Just an old man, a lost love, a train through the night. But then I realized, sometimes the quietest things live longest in the hearts of others. Not because they're grand, but because they're true." He read a few passages. The part Helen had written in a letter never sent. The scene where he wrote by lamplight as the train slipped through the mountains. The moment he returned to Ashwood Hollow and found the melody from years ago. When he paused, the silence lingered soft, full, before the room erupted into applause. Not thunderous, but grateful. A shared, quiet kind of thanks. At the end of the evening, a young woman approached him. Her voice trembled. "Mr. John, I read your story while I was in the hospital, dealing with anxiety and insomnia. I didn't believe in gentleness anymore, but because of you, I wrote a letter to my father after 10 years. John took her hand, his eyes glistening. "Thank you for telling me. That's why I write." That night, back in his hotel room, John stood at the window, watching the city lights below. The traffic moved like a flowing river, endless. Life pulsed on, people kept moving. But now, he no longer felt like a lost traveler on a night train. Before going to sleep, he opened his notebook and wrote one more line. "Maybe I missed the first train of my life, but some trains don't run on schedules. They arrive when we're ready, and sometimes, even the storyteller needs a listener to begin to heal." The final home of stories. One late afternoon in June, John returned to Ashwood Hollow, this time with no notebook in hand, and no plans to write anything more. There was only one thing he knew for certain now. This was where he wanted to spend the rest of his life. Helen's wooden cabin still sat quietly among the pine trees, filled with the scent of dry grass, mountain wind, and the calls of wild birds. Martha greeted him with a tight hug and tearful eyes. "I knew you'd come back," she said. "And this house, if you want it, it's yours." John went still. "Are you sure?" Martha nodded. Aunt Helen wrote in her will, "If John ever returns, let him live among the beautiful memories, because that's where he always belonged." John accepted, and in the days that followed, a new life quietly began, simple but deeply meaningful. He woke early each morning, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch, rereading letters and manuscripts. He began restoring the old back room of the house, turning it into a small library he named the Helen Reading Room. Each book on the shelf had a handwritten quote inside, chosen by John himself. Gentle, open-ended lines like, "You don't have to forget someone in order to move on. Love isn't meant to be kept, but understood. There are things we can't say to anyone, but we can write them down." Martha helped him connect with the local community. Appalachian mountain folks, mostly quiet and unassuming, but carrying with them silent treasures of memory. They began to visit the Helen Reading Room every Saturday afternoon, not to borrow books, but simply to sit, listen, and share. A woman spoke of her husband who had passed. An old man recalled sneaking out to see Elvis in 1960. A boy quietly read a poem to his mother, who had died when he was 3. John didn't take notes. He just listened, and he, too, began to reread his own writing with new eyes. His voice grew deeper, warmer, as if each word was no longer just a sentence, but a breath, a heartbeat. Autumn came early in the hollow. The leaves began to blush red. One morning, John received a letter from a small college in Tennessee. "We've been reading your work in our English department's course Writing to Heal. The students loved it so much, they've asked if you might consider teaching a short seminar. Writing from memory, writing from silence. If you're willing, it would be an honor." John read the letter, folded it gently, and thought. That evening, he asked Martha, "Do you think at my age, I should still stand in front of a classroom?" Martha laughed. "You've stood in front of people who were grieving, broken, silent, and somehow you made them open up. You think students would be harder than that?" John chuckled. "You have a point." And so that winter, John began teaching again, not in some big city, but at a small hilltop school. Just 12 students, each carrying a story they hadn't yet dared to write. John didn't start with topics. He taught them to begin with truth, what lived inside. He took them on walks through the forest, had them write under the red maples, read aloud beside running streams. One day, a student asked, "What if we don't have a clear story to tell?" John smiled. "Stories don't start with events. They start with a feeling. And that feeling is often the only thing left. When every memory has faded, That New Year's, John returned alone to the cabin. Snow blanketed the porch. He sat by the fireplace, opened his old leather journal, and wrote the final line. I once lived a quiet life. I once loved, once lost, once regretted. But I also told my story, and through that I lived again. If someone is reading these words now, then the story still lives on. The Stranger Beneath the Pines. In the early spring of the following year, Elliot, 23, a freshly graduated literature major, set off on a solo journey through the American South. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He just knew he needed to get away from academic essays, noisy cities, and that vague but persistent feeling that, despite being young, he had already lost something deep inside himself. 3 weeks into drifting through small towns, Elliot happened to stop in Ashwood Hollow. He chose the place because of its beautiful name, and because of a hand-painted wooden sign by the roadside that made him pull over. The Helen Reading Room, where stories find someone to listen. He stepped inside. An old, simple wooden house. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows. The wooden shelves sagged with age. At the center of the room stood a large pine table. On it, an open notebook and a note written in soft, looping script. You may read, you may write, or simply sit still and let the room tell its stories. Elliot took a seat. As he browsed the shelves, his fingers landed on a slim, dark leather volume with faded silver lettering. The Night Train Through the Appalachians, John Whitmore. He opened it, intending to read a few pages. But he didn't stop for 3 hours. Every word seemed to speak directly to him, about missed chances, unspoken things, and the quiet ache of living in a world that moves too fast. At the final page, a letter was tucked in. The handwriting was old, but steady. To the stranger, if you are reading this, I am likely no longer here. But this is not a farewell. I simply wanted to say, this room you're sitting in was once where I found myself again. And I hope that if your heart is quiet from something unspoken, you'll write too. Write not to become someone, but to keep something precious inside you alive. Everyone has their own night train. I've told you about mine. Now it's your turn. And if you're ready, let this room live on as a resting stop, a porch light for the lost. Don't be afraid. Just quietly open the door. Those who need it will come. John Whitmore. Elliot sat in silence. Then, slowly, he pulled out his own journal from his backpack. For the first time in months, he wrote, I used to think I had no story worth telling. But maybe the first thing you need is a place that believes your story deserves to be told. Today, I found that place. A year later, the Helen Reading Room was no longer just a library. Every Saturday, Elliot opened the doors to guests. There was now a box of warm tea on the table, a shelf labeled written by visitors, and a wall corner filled with unaddressed letters, notes people wrote and tucked into the wall, as if sending them into the past. One day, an older woman with silver hair arrived. She looked around and softly said, I once heard a man tell stories here. He had the eyes of someone who had loved very deeply. Elliot smiled. His name was John, and he's still telling stories. Through every book, every letter, every person who walks through that door. From Ashwood Hollow, the stories kept going. No fanfare, no promotion, just quietly spreading, like the flickering lights of a night train, winding its way through the Appalachians. Somewhere, someone is still reading, still writing, still finding their way home. The end. Every train has its final station, but stories, when told in truth, can live forever.